Japanese as an L2 specific. But I believe that the pedagogical implications, the relevance theoretic pedagogical framework, and the activities that I will be presenting here today will also be helpful in teaching other L2s. So first, I will provide you with some context for why we should be teaching pragmatics in the first place. Then I will talk about what are some current instructional challenges when it comes to the teaching of pragmatics. And finally, I will describe a pedagogical framework based on relevance theoretic notions that I have created for teaching pragmatics. And I will also show some pedagogical activities that apply this framework. So, see if I can move on to, okay. So the participants of my study were undergraduate students at 2 universities in Ireland. And these students, these learners, reported several challenging communicative acts in oral interaction with Japanese as L1 speakers. So learners reported experiencing challenges in processing several linguistic as well as non-linguistic features, including speech styles, ellipses, prosody, silence, gestures, back-channeling expressions, puns, and sarcasm. As you can see, the range of challenging communicative acts is quite extensive. And so what I did was examine these challenging communicative acts through the lens of relevance theory, and that allowed me to identify where the inference processes lie within these features, and particularly which type of cognitive abilities learners weren't activating in real-time processing. So the findings demonstrated that learners experience challenges with linguistic encoding, but also with phenomena that involve inference. And learners were particularly challenged by with the recovering of utterances with a considerable gap between their linguistic forms and the meaning that L1 speakers were aiming to convey, and that would be issues with recovering linguistic underdeterminacy. And learners were also challenged by recovering the associated attitude towards the propositional content, particularly manifested in speech styles, as well as with the recovering of assumptions communicated via both higher level explicatures and implicatures. And finally, learners also experienced challenges with recovering humorous effects. So as you may imagine, the consequences of experiencing these challenges I have just briefly mentioned were rather serious for learners, for reported interpersonal and affective issues, as well as many instances of communication breakdown. So learners, in terms of interpersonal issues, learners experience coming across as rude or distant, often offending their interlocutors or making them angry. And learners also experience being laughed at by L1 speakers due to the way they were conveying their thoughts and intentions, as well as their inappropriate or not relevant choice of linguistic and non-linguistic communicative features in real-time processing. In terms of affective issues, learners limited linguistic competence as well as their inability to tap into their pragmatic competence resulted in feelings of anger, frustration, anxiety, and worry. Learners often felt confused and overwhelmed by how Japanese speakers were conveying their thoughts, and they also reported feeling intimidated by some of the ostensive communicative acts that L1 speakers were using, such as silence, body expressions, and particularly back-channeling expressions, which are very prominent in the Japanese language. And finally, learners reported experiencing communication breakdown. That means that often learners could not recover the communicative intention of L1 speakers because they were unable to infer the assumptions that L1 speakers wanted to convey through the linguistic and non-linguistic acts that I mentioned earlier on. And that is because the use of certain ostensive stimuli did not lead to further expectation or further implications, and therefore did not satisfy learners' expectations of relevance. At the same time, learners could not make assumptions quickly enough or they could not recover the speaker's meaning at all, for which they expended extra processing effort that was not rewarded with increased cognitive effects. So as you can see, recovering utterances that require more processing effort and not being able to recover the proposition expressed comes with high-stake consequences for learners. It is therefore super important, it is imperative that we teach learners how to activate their pragmatic competence, so as these challenges can be minimized and even avoided. So the findings from this study indicate that there are at least 3 factors in current instructional practices that contribute to learners not being able to activate their pragmatic competence in real-time processing. And these instructional challenges are an excessive focus on linguistic input in the L2 classroom, the unawareness of learners' own pragmatic competence, and the lack of teaching about inferential processes. The first issue is that there is an excessive focus on linguistic input, and that means that certain features of the Japanese language, and probably other languages too, you might be able to tell me during the Q&A session, but certain features are not taught due to time constraints as well as a grammar-driven curriculum. So linguistic knowledge is taught without taking into consideration other very important factors involved in communication. And as a result of this, learners become too dependent on grammar forms as the main source to recover meaning, not searching for relevance outside those linguistic forms, or not entertaining other factors that are essential for the recovery, the successful recovery of intended interpretations. So what could instructors do about this? Well, we could bring awareness to other sensitive communicative acts, such as the ones I mentioned earlier on, and also teach beyond linguistic input. The second issue is that learners are unaware that they are pragmatically competent, at least in their L1. So the challenges that learners experience were more prominent at the beginning of their stay in Japan, and the more interactions they had, the better they were able to interpret and use communicative features. So this suggests that learners, most likely unconsciously, realized that they could apply the same inferential processes they do in their L1 to L2 communication. And this would indicate that learners indeed activate their pragmatic competence without previous instruction, but they do so implicitly, without conscious awareness, with high processing effort, and as we saw, it comes with high-stake consequences. So what can we instructors do about it? Well, we must bring learners' pragmatic competence to the surface by bringing awareness to inferential processes that take place in oral interaction. The third and final issue is that learners are not taught about inferential processes. So in the L2 classroom, there is no explicit, or there's usually no explicit mention of pragmatic aspects. And when there is, the discussion is usually centered around speech acts, such as apologizing or requesting, and concepts such as inference, explicatures, implicatures, ostension, you name it, are usually not part of the curriculum or part of our instructional practices. And as a result of that, learners are often unaware of which stimuli are used to overtly communicate meaning, to which degree this meaning is provided, and to what extent they need to provide information. So what could instructors do about this? Well, we must make successful and effective communication, aka pragmatic competence, a priority, and make the L2 classroom a space where communication is taught, not just linguistic forms in a decontextualized manner. So at this stage, you might be wondering, how can we bring awareness to other sensitive communicative acts? And how can we bring learners' pragmatic competence to the surface? And how do we make successful and effective communication a priority? Well, one way of achieving this is by using a relevance theoretic pedagogical framework for teaching pragmatics, a framework that is also based on teaching and learning principles grounded in second language acquisition. So the pedagogical framework I came up with is based on Ifantidou's relevance theoretic definition of pragmatic competence, which, unlike other approaches to pragmatics in DL2, takes into consideration inferential processes of human communication. So Ifantidou proposed this definition of pragmatic competence based on the results of her study, which focused on written comprehension of English as an L2. And therefore, as you can see here on the screen, the focus of her definition is on linguistic indexes. So she defines pragmatic competence as the ability to identify relevant linguistic indexes, retrieve relevant pragmatic effects, and explicate the link between lexical indexes and pragmatic effects retrieved. Later on, Pauline Madella expanded Ifantidou's framework to include the teaching of ostensive paralinguistic cues in oral comprehension in English as L2. So she removed from her definition linguistic indexes and included paralinguistic indexes instead. But that was not enough for me because I was focusing on oral interaction. And of course, with oral interaction, we need both. We need to become aware of linguistic forms as well as non-linguistic forms. So I redefined or modified this definition of pragmatic competence to suit the needs of my study. And this is my proposed definition. Pragmatic competence is the ability to become aware of pragmatics, first and foremost, identify relevant linguistic and non-linguistic ostensive stimuli, retrieve relevant pragmatic effects, and justify the link between the ostensive stimulus and the pragmatic effects retrieved. So the biggest differences between this definition and previous ones are the inclusion of both linguistic and non-linguistic ostensive stimuli, not just one or the other, and also the inclusion of a previous step, which is becoming aware of pragmatics as a key aspect of activating learners' pragmatic competence. So this revised definition captures a wider range of communicative phenomena, as well as features, such as the ones identified challenging by learners. As this definition is based on abilities, familiarizing, identifying, retrieving, and justifying, it can also be used as a pedagogical framework to teach pragmatics, and it can also be used to inform the creation of pedagogical activities that may help in the activation of pragmatic competence. So now I'll show you how we could use this pedagogical framework in practice. So the first phase is pragmatics familiarization. And for this phase, I would discuss the role of pragmatics as a means to achieving effective oral interaction. So this is a phase for learners to become acquainted with some of the terminology in pragmatics: inference, ostension, relevance, implicature, explicator, intention, etc., and also make them aware of their pre-existing pragmatic competence in their L1. So here I would use these concepts, or I would explain these key notions in their L1, and I would prompt learners to think about these concepts and how we apply them in their L2. And we can make learners aware of pragmatics throughout the academic year or throughout the semester in small doses, and through examples that that may come up in textbooks that we are already using. And I give you an example here of a Japanese textbook that we use at the Autonomous University of Barcelona to teach second-year Japanese. And this is a listening activity. And through this listening activity, what I did was bring awareness to higher level explicatures, what they are, what they represent in L2 communication. And I brought learners' awareness to the use of prosody and central signal particles to convey intentions. And I also used this very short listening comprehension task to talk about linguistic underdeterminacy. So in this particular text, we have ellipses, and we have particularly ellipses, so cases of loose syntax. So I use this text to talk about how the linguistic forms are sometimes not enough in communicating, and that we need to look for other aspects of communication or contextual cues if we want to interact effectively. For phase B, awareness of authentic stimuli, I encourage learners to bring their attention to a feature of their L2 to increasing degrees until they understand it as intentional. So if learners are not aware that a linguistic or non-linguistic feature is used ostensibly to openly and deliberately present evidence about the speaker's intentions, they might not be able to make inferences about the intentions as easily or at all. So here you have an activity that focuses on raising awareness of non-linguistic stimuli, particularly silence. So as you know, sometimes we use silence and we don't mean anything by it, but sometimes we use silence to communicate our intentions. So we could show two short video clips in our classroom, one with silence being used ostensibly and one not being used ostensibly. And we could prompt learners to identify which one is a communicative act and which one isn't. So at this stage, learners do not need to know what the pragmatic effect is or what do these silences mean, but they must simply understand that as it happens in their L1, we use linguistic and non-linguistic features to communicate meaning, and that we need to pay attention to them and become familiar with these features to be able to communicate effectively. And as you can see as well, in order to minimize those affective issues that learners may experience later on, we can also bring in questions that tackle those affective factors in L2 communication, such as how do these silences make you feel? In the third phase, pragmatic awareness, we could show interactions where a relevant interpretation is achieved, as well as an interaction where relevant interpretation is not achieved, and ask learners to analyze what went right or what went wrong. So here we could show a communicative act and prompt learners to work with plausible interpretations by asking them, for example, what do you interpret here with this particular act in this particular context? And here I have put some useful questions that you might want to use when it comes to discussing pragmatic awareness, such as what are the implicatures, what are the propositional attitudes being conveyed, etc., etc. And here we have an activity that raises pragmatic awareness. So this focuses on both receptive and productive oral skills. And this activity basically asks learners to pair up with an L1 speaker and discuss freely about a topic previously learned in the classroom. And it asks them to particularly pay attention to how they use a certain linguistic or non-linguistic feature. In this case, the example is about speech styles and ellipses. So they would record that and then when listening to the recording, they would become cognitively engaged by analyzing their natural speech and making them consciously aware of how they and their and L1 speakers convey intentions using those targeted features particular to the L2. And this is the last one, phase D, metapragmatic awareness, where teachers help learners become aware of the link between the pragmatic effects or intentions retrieved and the linguistic and non-linguistic features that triggered those intentions. So this phase involves the tasks of explaining and justifying, and we can help learners achieve those by asking them questions such as, how did you reach that particular interpretation? Or why is this form the most relevant communicative act in that particular situation? And here I would encourage learners to also think about their L1 to justify and explain what happens in their L2. In that way, they would see that there's a lot of similarities, if not identical processes that go on in L2 communication. So this is the last example, the last activity that I have for you, which raises learners' metapragmatic awareness through the use of bodily expressions and gestures as implicatures. So learners watch an interaction where those are used, and they are asked to justify the link between the bodily expressions and gestures used, the linguistic forms that accompany them, if any, and the pragmatic effects retrieved. And they are encouraged to reflect and discuss what makes those particular acts of intentional communication the most relevant ones in this particular interaction. And are also asked to think about, as I mentioned just now, about their L1 to explain what happens in the L2. So asking questions such as, would you accompany these same gestures with linguistic forms in your L1, or would you use a different kind of gesture, etc., etc. Okay, so that was all from my part. I hope that I have given you some helpful ideas and practical tools to apply relevance theoretic frameworks and notions to the teaching of pragmatics in the L2. And yeah, questions, feedback are absolutely welcome.
Thanks very much.
I'll stop sharing now. Sorry.
Thank you. So yeah, we've got time for questions or comments from anybody. I do have one myself, but I'm waiting to see if somebody else wants to ask one. Okay, I'm going to ask it, if that's okay. I'm wondering to what extent some of the thinking behind it is to do with making L2 people develop things in similar ways to L1 people, which is a common thing in L2 contexts. You want to give them a similar experience to L1, and of course, you can't really. If you're going to be teaching pragmatics, you can't just do it. I mean, that would be the same as just throwing them into a place where a load of people are speaking. But was the design of the tasks influenced by thinking about making it more similar to L1 experiences than it might otherwise have been? You see what I mean?
It wasn't pretty. That's a great question, actually, and something I didn't consider it that way. So it wasn't about getting them closer to L1 interactions. I think what I wanted to aim for is making sure that we understand that pragmatic principles are universal. There's nothing unique about the pragmatic processes that go on in L2 communication, being Japanese, which might be a very different language to those who speak English, for example, or Spanish. And make them realize that they already know how to recover implicatures, how to recover explicatures. They already know about what linguistic underdeterminacy is, but they just don't know how to apply those concepts or those processes in L2 communication. So it wasn't necessarily a way of saying, that's how L1 communication works. Let's try to make it as close to that as possible. No, just giving them tools to say, look, it's easier than we think. We already have the tools. Let's apply them to L2 communication now. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. Yeah. I mean, it really chimed with me when you spoke about how so much of the work on L2 pragmatics is things like apologizing, all these different speech acts. And every time I want to work with my students on how pragmatics is relevant to L2 teaching, it's a bit disappointing to find so much of it is that. And your set of tasks seem much more likely to actually be relevant and have a useful impact on the learners.
Yeah, so a lot of the activities or frameworks used in interlanguage pragmatics are about communicative features, so addressing how to teach certain communicative features, particularly speech acts. But as we know, pragmatics is about interpreting utterances, and we need activities that target precisely that, and the cognitive processes that go behind interpreting those utterances and those non-linguistic features. So something different, I think, from what has been done so far in the interlanguage pragmatics field.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There's still a few minutes if anybody else has a question. Yeah, Ryoko.
Thank you, Erika. It was very interesting. And just a question. So your research was very much based on Japanese, right? So how applicable will it be for other languages? And the reason I'm asking is, say, as you just mentioned, Japanese is quite distant language compared to, like, say, English and Spanish pair. So there will be a lot more sort of non-linguistic differences, more culturally bound differences as well. So if you are to claim that it is universal, yes, I am like convinced by your argument it is, but at the same time, there are definitely culturally bound differences. And how can you then develop, say, teaching materials or teacher training syllabus if it is, if the original research you did was for Japanese only?
Yeah, that is actually a great question as well. So of course we have to be culturally sensitive and be aware of the cultural differences between and linguistic differences between languages. So for example, Japanese might use more non-linguistic features to communicate, while other languages might not. But these are communicative features. So the activities that I designed and the pedagogical framework target the cognitive processes, and then we can use those cognitive processes applied to different communicative features. So if you are studying, let's say, Spanish or Catalan, you might want to focus on the lack of personal pronouns in sentences, or other specific features that are more, other features that are more specific to those languages. But that doesn't mean that the activities are not applicable to any or other languages. So we might want to change the extensive stimuli that we target, not the cognitive processes themselves.
Thank you. That makes sense. Yeah, great.
Thank you. Still a couple of minutes for any other questions.
I just saw a message from, I hope I might pronounce this wrong, Titinard, who is asking me to send him the presentation because he missed part of it. So I will do that as well.
I think we will be sending out emails to all speakers today and asking them to send us the PowerPoint if they wish to do so, and we will put these together as well. So yeah, we'll do some announcing at the end.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we've only got a minute-ish left, so if there are no other questions, I think we'll just thank Erika now, and that will let her
Thank you.
ready. Thank you.